Like most people, I grew up watching Warner Brothers cartoons, but it wasn't until a couple of months ago that I decided to sit down and actually actively watch and analyze a lot of the Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies cartoons. And in doing so, I came to realize the importance of Mel Blanc. Mel Blanc voices pretty much every popular Warner Brothers character, apart from Elmer Fudd, who is voiced by Arthur Q. Bryan. And I thought I want to find out more about him and also more about his work with Warner Brothers. So I sought out some books and realized that he actually had an autobiography that was published, I believe, in 1989, and it's brilliantly titled That's Not All, Folks. And I kind of like that because Mel Blanc is known for his voice with Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies, but that's not all he did. And the autobiography talks a little bit about his early years, but most of it is focusing on his professional career and how he got into that. And that is something that I really enjoyed. I liked learning kind of his background and how he not so much fell into doing voice work, but kind of how he ended up working for Warner Brothers and which characters he originally voiced and his thought process behind how he created certain characters, and of course the actual technical side of what it's like to, or what it was like back in the day. I don't know exactly how many similarities still exist because technology obviously quickens a lot of the processes, but what his process was like for voicing a character and how long it would take from him providing the voices to the film or cartoon being ready for broadcast. And that aspect of it, I think, is detailed very well. We also do get to learn about his personal life, his wife, his son, and a lot of his early struggles as well. About, with money, basically, how he started off doing this job and that job just to bring in the money, and then eventually he got bigger offers for more money. And kind of what I think is great about Mel Blanc is that his celebrity grew very steadily. He didn't become an overnight success, largely because voiceover artists did not get credit. And he kind of championed that, at least as far as it explains, and I will actually talk about that in a moment. But at one point he explains, he asked for more money, and he wasn't going to get more money, so he said, well, can I have a credit? And by giving his name credit on the films, on the cartoons, people could then ask for him personally to do work because they knew who he was and who was doing the voices of Porky Pig and Sylvester and Bugs Bunny, etc. And that's brilliant. But I do think it's very difficult with autobiographies to strike the balance between being humble and celebrating your successes. And sometimes I feel like Mel Blanc wrote this, and I have to point out it is co-written. It's co-written with Philip Bash. I assume Bash did most of the writing, and Mel Blanc told his story. But there are times when it feels kind of big-headed, and there are times when I felt like he was maybe blowing his trumpet a little bit too much. And yes, it is an autobiography. You're supposed to talk about your successes as well as your struggles. But sometimes I feel like it was maybe taken a little bit too far. And for example, there's one anecdote, and I actually can't remember what it was, but it was near the beginning, where he said he was responsible for creating such and such a character or a character's name, where I'd read elsewhere that somebody else had been responsible for it. So I have to take what he says with a pinch of salt. If you know of anything specific in this that isn't true or that's exaggerated, please feel free to share that information. But generally speaking, it is a beautiful celebration of his successes and also various struggles that he had to overcome, mostly, of course, with money, which, most artists do have to face that at some point. It's also got a kind of shock element to it because, without saying too much, because I didn't know this, and I don't want to spoil it in case you do wish to read this, but he had a pretty horrific accident. And the book kind of starts off with that and then takes us back through his life, almost as if he is, I don't want to say lying on his deathbed, that sounds too extreme. I'm not sure quite how accurate that was, but almost as if he's had this accident and is going back looking over his entire life and then coming full circle. So actually the structure of the autobiography I think is very effective. It's definitely written for effect and for shock factor, at least in certain parts, but it works well. It is well written. I didn't personally spot a single typing error, which for me is something that really irritates me in professionally published books. Today, more so than ever, because it's so much easier to change it today. But I didn't. It is well written. The layout of the book is great. It's very easy to read. The font is fine, or the typeface. And the information is interesting. It does focus on quite a lot of his radio work after his successes with Warner Brothers, and those bits I didn't find that interesting. He seems to talk a lot about, well, he seems to name drop, put it that way, which is interesting enough in bits, but he seems to talk more about other people than he does himself in certain areas, which is, again, something that can happen in autobiographies, but there's a balance that needs to be struck. And I just think that in certain parts of this, the balance isn't quite right. So it's, in terms of an autobiography, it's not the best written. But in terms of the actual quality of the writing, the way the sentences flow, the diction, everything there is absolutely fine. It is an easy read and a pleasant enough read. It is fascinating. It's educational if you're interested in the history of animation. And indeed, if you're interested in the history of Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies, because I did learn one or two things about certain characters and how they were created. So I enjoyed it, but I didn't enjoy it as much as I expected. I thought it would be one that I would devour, or try to stop myself from devouring, as I do try to slow down on books that I absolutely love because I want them to last longer. But I kind of found myself, sometimes I would sit and read quite a few chapters in a row, and sometimes it felt like almost a chore to get back to it if the last chapter had been not the best written. So it's not perfect, but absolutely, if you're interested in Mel Blanc's work, or Warner Brothers, Looney Tunes, or the history of animation, or radio in particular as well, I think That's Not All Folks is one that you will definitely enjoy. It's well worth the read. It's actually, in the UK at least, quite difficult to get hold of. It's not that cheap. I found it on Amazon. No, I didn't. I got it on eBay. I found it on eBay cheaper. So you may need to hunt around to find the best price. But I do think it's worth it. If it's something that you think you'll be interested in, it's probably well worth the read.